Preface to the English translation. Solzhenitsyn opens Volume 3 by telling the reader that, after the darkness of the first two volumes, this final volume will reveal another side of the archipelago, not only suffering and destruction, but resistance. The Soviet state, he argues, has been almost as determined to conceal the struggle against the camp system as to conceal the scale of the camps themselves. Men and women, placed in seemingly hopeless conditions, discovered forms of moral and collective resistance that could reach extraordinary intensity precisely because the machinery surrounding them was so strong. He insists that the endurance of the communist system should not be mistaken for proof that its victims submitted willingly. Its power was immense, and its methods made organized opposition extraordinarily difficult. In the camps of the early 1950s, resistance first took violent forms, particularly the killing of informers. Solzhenitsyn does not glorify terrorism. He calls it a condemnable instrument, and treats its emergence as another example of evil reproducing itself. But he distinguishes the camp violence of prisoners defending themselves against informers from terrorism directed casually against innocent people. The central theme of the volume will be how a population trained for decades in submission gradually learned again to resist. Part 5. Katorga, Chapter 1. The Doomed. Solzhenitsyn begins Part 5 with the revival of an old Russian word, Katorga, hard labor in its most punitive form. The February Revolution had abolished the institution, but Stalin restored it in April 1943, immediately after the Soviet victory at Stalingrad had begun changing the course of the war. Along with the return of the gallows came special hard labor camps for prisoners, regarded as especially dangerous. The symbolism matters to Solzhenitsyn. A revolutionary state that had rejected the vocabulary of the old order gradually restored titles such as officer and general, and now restored Katorga as well. The early wartime Katorga camps at Vorkuta, Norilsk, and Zhezkazgan were intended, in Solzhenitsyn's description, to consume their prisoners. Men were crowded into primitive huts, worked 12-hour shifts without regular rest days, marched under armed guard, beaten and confined under prison-like conditions even after work. Food and movement were tightly controlled. Political prisoners could be robbed by criminal prisoners used in service positions. Numbers marked the doomed as a separate caste. The distinction between imprisonment and execution became blurred because a sentence could be arranged so that the prisoner's body was destroyed slowly while still producing labor. The chapter then expands beyond camp administration into the wartime population from which many Katorga prisoners came. As Soviet armies reconquered territory that had been occupied by Germany, tribunals followed them. Some people were publicly hanged. Others were sentenced for collaboration, service in German organized police or military formations, or other behavior under occupation. Solzhenitsyn argues that these cases cannot be understood without looking backward at what Soviet power had done before the German invasion. He attacks the later habit of describing every Soviet citizen who welcomed the Germans, worked for them, or joined anti-Soviet formations as if the explanation were simple treason. Before 1941, the countryside had experienced collectivization, dispossession, famine, religious persecution, and political terror. Millions had passed through camps in exile. Workers had been subjected to increasingly coercive labor laws. Families had disappeared into prisons or deportation. When the Soviet state suddenly demanded unconditional, patriotic loyalty during the invasion, some people remembered what that state had done to them. Solzhenitsyn gives particular attention to peasants. He portrays much of the Russian countryside in 1941 as deeply alienated from Stalinist rule. Villagers remembered losing land, livestock, churches, relatives, and freedom under collectivization. The German invasion, therefore, did not initially appear to everyone simply as an attack on a beloved political order. In some places, German troops were welcomed because people imagined that foreign occupation might destroy the collective farms or the communist government. German policy soon revealed its own brutality and colonial ambitions, but Solzhenitsyn insists that the original expectations cannot be erased from the historical record merely because the Nazis proved monstrous. The same argument leads to the Vlasov movement and to Soviet soldiers who crossed over or volunteered for German-sponsored Russian units. Solzhenitsyn stresses that motives varied. Hunger in prisoner of war camps mattered, but it was not the only motive. Some men consciously hoped to use the war against Germany and the Soviet Union as an opportunity to fight Stalin. He recalls examples of Soviet officers and soldiers who volunteered in large numbers when anti-Stalin Russian formations were proposed. He also points to Russian local administrations and militias that emerged in occupied territory, and to civilians who retreated westward with the Germans, rather than remain for the return of Soviet power. For Solzhenitsyn, the crucial moral question is whether Russians opposed to Stalin had the right to seek assistance from a foreign enemy. He does not pretend the question is easy. Nazi Germany was engaged in a war of conquest and committed enormous crimes. Yet he refuses to allow Soviet ideology to answer the question by definition. He draws a provocative comparison with the Bolsheviks themselves, who would use German assistance and the collapse of Russia during the First World War to advance revolution. Lenin had explicitly called for transforming imperial war into civil war. Solzhenitsyn asks why conduct celebrated as revolutionary strategy in 1917 should become metaphysically different when anti-Bolsheviks attempted something analogous in the next war. His purpose is not to absolve every collaborator. It is to restore political causation. A government cannot persecute millions, destroy their families, confiscate their property, close their churches, and then assume that patriotic loyalty will remain untouched. People who had been stepped on had the capacity to hate those who stepped on them. Solzhenitsyn uses the discovery of mass graves at Vinica under German occupation as an example of what local populations could learn about Soviet repression, and then asks how such people were expected to react when the state later demanded that they support its return. As the war ended, the original wartime Katorga regime gradually softened because killing prisoners too rapidly wasted labor. The distinction between Katorga and ordinary corrective labor camps blurred. Then Stalin created a new solution. Beginning in 1948, political prisoners were separated into special camps. The most serious Article 58 categories, including alleged traitors, nationalists, spies, terrorists, wreckers, and members of supposed anti-Soviet organizations, were directed into these camps under a stricter regime. Prisoners convicted merely of isolated anti-Soviet agitation could sometimes remain in ordinary camps, while anyone whose criticism could be interpreted as involving a group was more likely to be transferred. The new camps were given coded, almost poetic names such as Gorlag, Reklag, Ozerlag, Steplag, and others. Their prisoners would wear numbers and live under intensified security. What began as wartime Katorga had evolved into a new institution designed to isolate political prisoners from the criminal world and from ordinary camp inmates. That separation, meant to make repression safer, would have an unintended consequence. By concentrating embittered political prisoners together and giving many of them sentences of 25 years, the state created a population with very little left to lose. Chapter 2. The First Whiff of Revolution. Solzhenitsyn describes his own transfer toward a special camp in 1950 as a psychological turning point. Earlier in his sentence, he had fought to escape general labor and obtain protected technical work. In the Sharashka, he had food, warmth, cleanliness, and intellectual employment, but he increasingly disliked the price of comfort, dependence on the authorities, and the need to preserve a privileged position. Writing had become more important to him than butter or sugar. When he was removed from that protected world and sent toward a special camp, he experienced the transfer not only as another punishment, but as a strange return to moral independence. The journey took months through prisons and prisoner trains. The new intake differed from the prisoners of earlier years. Instead of the familiar 10-year sentences, young and old alike now announced release dates 25 years in the future. A man sentenced in 1950 might be expected to leave in 1975. Such terms altered the logic of prison discipline. A prisoner already facing a quarter century had far less reason to fear an additional few years. Solzhenitsyn felt that the authorities had exhausted their most powerful threat. That change could be heard in conversations with guards. On a prisoner train, a young escort casually used the phrase, "enemies of the people." Instead of shrinking into silence, prisoners shouted back. They asked why collective farms were hungry, why prison vans had to be disguised if the state was proud of its justice, and why veterans whose sons had died in the war were now enemies. A sergeant joined the argument rather than immediately punishing them. Solzhenitsyn interpreted the exchange as a faint sign of a new relationship. Prisoners were beginning to speak aloud. The Korean War intensified this mood. The prisoners listened to official reports and, from their military experience, distrusted the claim that North Korea had merely responded to aggression while advancing deeply on the first day. They began hoping for a larger war. This hope was morally desperate rather than geopolitical. Men sentenced to decades in camps could imagine almost any external catastrophe as preferable to a slow death behind wire. Some openly wished for foreign bombs, even if prisoners and jailers died together. They believed that only a shock from outside might break the structure holding them. In transit, Solzhenitsyn encountered the human composition of the future special camp. Many prisoners were from the Baltic states. Estonian and Lithuanian peasants had been arrested during collectivization and political cleansing after Soviet annexation. Western Ukrainians included members or alleged supporters of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, but also people punished for giving food or shelter to insurgents. Russians included repeat political prisoners. There were foreigners and people whose paths through war and occupation had brought them into Soviet custody. These encounters forced Solzhenitsyn to reconsider questions of nationality. He felt ashamed before Baltic prisoners whose countries had been absorbed by the Soviet Union. He thought about the long and difficult relationship between Russians and Ukrainians, and rejected the habit of reducing Ukrainian nationalism to the single insult banderist. Soviet declarations had once proclaimed the right of peoples to self-determination, yet later Soviet power treated actual attempts to exercise national independence as counter-revolution. The prisoner community was politically heterogeneous, but a common condition was forming beneath those differences. Old socialists, nationalists, believers, soldiers, peasants, and people with no coherent political program were all being placed in the same institutions. Volodya Gershuny, an energetic young prisoner, could still imagine that the special camp might contain recognizable political parties, and that prisoners would have to decide with whom they belonged. Solzhenitsyn sees this as naive. The state had already chosen their common category for them. Whatever their previous doctrines, they were now people condemned politically and isolated together. Transit prisons themselves felt unusually loose compared with the fear of earlier years. Prisoners exchanged news between cells, talked through cracks, approached windows, and encountered deported families. The relaxation was small, but after years of atomization it felt revolutionary. The men increasingly believed that the ground was shifting beneath their jailers. This belief was exaggerated. Stalin was still alive, the special camps were severe, and there was no external liberation on the horizon. Yet the psychological transformation was real. The prisoners no longer automatically accepted the state's moral categories. They were learning that a man could be sentenced as an enemy and still speak as a citizen, argue with a guard, defend another nationality, or call himself a revolutionary against the Soviet state. The first whiff of revolution was therefore not yet an organized movement, it was the recovery of a voice. Chapter 3. Chains. Chains. Arrival in the special camps crushed many of the prisoners' romantic expectations. The freer atmosphere of transit prisons did not continue automatically behind the reinforced fences. Decades of ordinary gulag had trained prisoners in obedience, and the new political population initially carried that habit with it. Solzhenitsyn recalls blacksmiths at Minlag who refused to forge bars for prison windows and were punished while others failed to support them. The courage existed before the solidarity. The special camp regime deliberately tightened every mechanism of control. At Jezkazgan, prisoners encountered handcuffs capable of being clamped painfully tight and used for punishment rather than merely restraint. Fences were reinforced. Barbed wire multiplied. Machine guns covered routes and crossroads. Every camp had disciplinary barracks, and punishment commonly involved cold, reduced clothing, hunger, isolation, and confinement. Huts themselves were treated as prison cells, with barred windows, night locks, and latrine buckets. Most symbolically, the prisoner lost his name. Special camp inmates wore large number patches on their clothing. The number appeared on different parts of the uniform and had to remain visible. Solzhenitsyn emphasizes the assault on individuality. The state had already taken profession, property, freedom, and ordinary civic identity. The special camp now attempted to replace the personal name with a number in daily administration. The prisoners also learned that the new camps were constructed by prisoner labor. At Ekibastus, Solzhenitsyn and his companions worked as bricklayers and laborers on buildings that would strengthen their own confinement, including a major disciplinary prison inside the camp. The irony became one of the chapter's central images. Slaves received extra food for efficiently building the cells in which rebellious slaves would later be punished. Yet, while prisoners laid stone, escapes began erupting around them. Men tried vehicles, hiding places, tunnels, and sudden breaks across the perimeter. Some were shot, others returned beaten and bloody. Captured escapees could be displayed to discourage the rest. The ordinary calculation was obvious. The chance of success was tiny, and failure brought torture or additional punishment. Instead of suppressing the idea, however, repeated attempts made escape contagious. One group hid for days in an almost impossibly small space. Others tried breaking out in vehicles. The administration responded with new trenches, barriers, searches, and disciplinary construction. Every escape attempt generated more security, and the prisoners themselves were ordered to build it. Then came an attempt that changed the mood. On September 17th, Georgy Tenno and Nikolai Janok escaped so cleanly that the administration did not initially know how many men were missing or how they had gone. Recounts consumed the camp. Work stopped. For days there was no news of recapture. The effect on the remaining prisoners was electric. They understood that punishment would follow and that security would tighten. But they were delighted. A successful escape belonged symbolically to everyone still inside. The event proved that the perimeter was not a law of nature. As the new disciplinary barracks rose stone by stone, prisoners silently hoped that Tenno and Zdenok were still moving beyond it. Chapter 4. Why did we stand for it? Solzhenitsyn anticipates the accusation that the prisoners themselves were responsible for their degradation because they did not revolt sooner. Why, if millions were imprisoned, numbered, starved, and worked toward death, did they continue obeying orders and even build their own disciplinary prisons? He begins by attacking deterministic theories of revolution. A comfortable historian can declare that genuine revolutions arise only from the correct progressive class, and therefore dismiss prisoner resistance in advance. Solzhenitsyn turns the logic around. If millions of people can be confined for decades, that too must be treated as a historical fact requiring explanation. The archipelago cannot be reduced to the personal whims of Stalin or Beria, while the society and institutions that made it possible disappear from analysis. He then compares Soviet repression with the political prisons and exile of the old Russian Empire. He does not present Imperial Russia as free or humane. It used exile, imprisonment, hard labor, censorship, and execution. But he argues that the difference in degree became a difference in kind. 19th century revolutionaries often retained communication with one another and with society, received assistance from sympathizers, possessed money, read and wrote, and could sometimes escape with astonishing ease. Public opinion existed outside the prison system and placed limits on what authorities could do without consequence. Solzhenitsyn repeatedly contrasts the fate of earlier revolutionaries with that of 20th century prisoners. Statements that would later produce an Article 58 case could once result in relatively mild punishment. Political exiles sometimes lived in towns, maintained intellectual work, or escaped with assistance from civilians. A recaptured exile might simply be returned to complete the original term. The surrounding population did not face the same risk for helping him. The Soviet prisoner confronted a different environment. Camp perimeters were stronger, guard forces more systematic, documents more tightly controlled, and punishment for escape vastly more severe. More important, society outside had been trained not to help. Civilians feared the security organs, feared association with fugitives, and sometimes denounced escapees for ideological reasons or reward. Geography, passports, police posts, collective surveillance, and public fear extended the prison far beyond the fence. The same difference explains why hunger strikes and protests were harder. Earlier political prisoners could rely on newspapers, lawyers, political parties, relatives, and public scandal to amplify their actions. The Soviet camp was deliberately sealed from any independent public opinion. A strike involving thousands could remain invisible to the country. Without an audience outside, even heroic self-sacrifice could be contained locally. Solzhenitsyn also examines the psychological legacy of previous decades. Prisoners had been arrested individually, interrogated individually, transported in guarded groups, and taught that collective action produced only additional suffering. Criminal prisoners and informers fragmented solidarity. Short sentences encouraged some inmates to wait quietly. Loyal communists could still regard rebellion as morally wrong. Hunger reduced political thought to the next ration. The state had spent years training the prisoner to survive alone, but the chapter's answer is ultimately a rejection of the premise. The prisoners did not simply endure forever. In the special camps, circumstances changed. Political prisoners were concentrated together. The criminal caste was partly removed. 25-year sentences weakened the threat of additional punishment. Veterans of war had experience with weapons and organization. Nationalist prisoners brought traditions of underground discipline. Religious believers brought communities of trust. The death of hope and ordinary release could itself produce courage. Solzhenitsyn therefore asks the reader to continue. The question is no longer why the prisoners did nothing. It is how men who had been reduced to isolated laboring bodies rediscovered collective identity and began to resist. The special camps would become the setting in which people officially denied the status of political prisoners began acting like political prisoners again. Chapter 5: Poetry Under a Tombstone, Truth Under a Stone. By the time Solzhenitsyn reached Ekibastas, his attitude toward camp survival had changed. Earlier, he had regarded escape from general labor as the first commandment of the educated prisoner. A desk, technical post, or protected assignment seemed necessary simply to remain alive. Now he deliberately accepted the hard bottom of camp existence and trained as a bricklayer. Later, he worked at a foundry. The decision was not a celebration of destructive labor. It was an attempt to stop organizing his entire moral life around the pursuit of privilege. This mattered because he was writing. In a special camp, possession of manuscripts was dangerous. A prisoner could have paper for approved purposes, but personal writing could be seized and interpreted politically. Solzhenitsyn therefore developed a method of composing small portions, polishing them on paper, memorizing them, and destroying the physical text. Verse seemed easier to preserve in memory, so he used poetic form, even when prose might have suited the material better. His memory became an archive that could pass through searches because the guards could not confiscate what was held in his head. This secret work created an internal territory separate from camp. While marching in a guarded column or laboring at a work site, lines could come to him with enough force that the surrounding camp temporarily lost its dominance. He describes this as a form of freedom. His body remained numbered and watched, but the work forming in his mind belonged to him. General labor also placed him among people he might never have met in protected offices. He notices a Tolstoyan who had refused military service because he believed a person must not kill and had crossed into Afghanistan during the war, only to be imprisoned there and eventually returned to Soviet custody. The man's presence forces Solzhenitsyn to ask what it means for the state to praise Tolstoy as a national treasure while punishing anyone who tries seriously to live by Tolstoy's moral doctrines. Other encounters create an improvised university. A Polish engineer can display a form of trust that camp habits would normally condemn as stupidity. A Romanian-trained intellectual can introduce subjects such as psychology or yoga. Religious believers, nationalists, former officers, technicians, peasants, and intellectuals carry fragments of civilizations and experiences that official Soviet life had kept apart. Solzhenitsyn feels again the frustration he had known in his first prison cell. There is too much to learn, and too little time. The chapter's title joins the concealment of art with the concealment of truth. Poems survive under the metaphorical tombstone because they cannot be printed. Truth survives under the stone because public speech is impossible, yet neither is completely dead. Memory, conversation, humor, and the moral example of other prisoners preserve them. One figure who embodies this underground truth is Kishkin, a prisoner whose weapon is satire. He mocks camp slogans, shortages, official pretensions, and the prisoner's own submissiveness. Working among dirty dishes, he can suddenly demonstrate how fiercely a starving prisoner defends his bowl, and then use the moment to show the audience how passivity operates. He ridicules the contrast between official claims of agricultural abundance and actual hunger. He punctures the dignity of officials with jokes that spread rapidly through the camp. Kishkin's method matters because laughter redistributes power. Guards possess weapons and disciplinary authority, but a joke can make their authority ridiculous in front of hundreds of prisoners. On one occasion, when warders attempt to displace inmates from good seats at a rare film showing, Kishkin's ironic remark turns the scene against them, and they withdraw. On another, he uses clowning to shame prisoners who have crowded obediently for entertainment until they disperse rather than continue behaving like a herd. Solzhenitsyn does not claim that poetry or satire dismantles the camp. Their importance lies elsewhere. The special camp was designed to reduce people to labor, numbers, appetite, and obedience. A prisoner who remembers a poem, thinks seriously about another man's convictions, laughs at a pompous official, or recognizes the absurdity of propaganda has retained mental activity not assigned by the institution. Before collective resistance can become political, the prisoner must recover the capacity to see the system from outside its own language. In Ekibastos, that recovery is underway. Chapter 6. The Committed Escaper. The central figure of this chapter is Georgy Pavlovich Tenno, whom Solzhenitsyn presents as the pure type of the committed escaper. Such a prisoner does not treat escape as a fantasy to be discussed on dark evenings and forgotten the next morning. From the moment he is confined, he organizes his life around getting out. A tolerable job, a parcel, a better ration, or the prospect of eventual review cannot reconcile him to captivity. Every day is either preparation, flight, or recovery from the punishment imposed after recapture. Tenno's idea of freedom is deliberately elemental. Asked what he expects to find outside when the Soviet landscape itself is filled with police, documents, and informers, he answers that even a single day in the taiga without chains is freedom. For him, the question is not whether escape produces a secure new life. It is whether he accepts the premise that another human institution has the final right to keep him behind wire. His biography helps explain his temperament. He had run away as a child, had gone to sea, served aboard ships, trained as an acrobat and circus performer, studied languages, and served with the Northern Fleet during the war, including contact with Allied convoys. Physical agility, curiosity, maritime experience, and a lifelong instinct to move all became resources in camp. But instinct is not enough. Tenno studies escape as a discipline. He questions recaptured fugitives, learns how camps search for tunnels, how freight cars are inspected, how dogs are used, how guards respond to missing prisoners, what civilian documents are needed, and how geography determines the possibilities of flight. Asking such questions is itself dangerous, because security is interested in anyone who shows unusual curiosity about escape. A supposed veteran fugitive may even be working as bait for the authorities. Solzhenitsyn emphasizes that the theory is simple only in formulation: escape by any workable method, and do not be caught. In practice, every stage branches into problems. Should one leave from the living zone or a work site, alone or with companions? What food can be accumulated without attracting notice? How can civilian clothing, knives, wire cutters, matches, maps, or money be obtained? What route avoids settlements without producing death from thirst or exposure? How can a shaved prisoner acquire a believable identity? And what happens when companions disagree? Attempts to escape from prisoner trains illustrate this mixture of ingenuity and frustration. A tiny hacksaw can be used to attack a freight car plank, only for the prisoners to discover that a guard's platform lies directly outside the opening. Every security device represents knowledge accumulated from previous attempts, while every prisoner studies the device for its weakness. Gulag and the escaper are engaged in a continuous technical competition. Tenno's greatest preparations at Ekibastos involve Nikolai Zhdanov. They exploit Tenno's involvement in cultural work and rehearsal to create uncertainty about where the two men are supposed to be. They assemble food, civilian clothes, a knife, improvised fire-making equipment, and a plan for crossing the perimeter at the narrow interval before dogs are deployed for the night. Friends help without necessarily knowing the full plan. An elderly Tatar escape veteran, Hafiz, understands and gives them his blessing. The eve of the attempt exposes the psychological core of escape. Tenno knows that he may be dead by the next evening. A rough coffin being carried through camp reminds him of a prisoner recently shot while escaping. The rational argument for staying is strong. Yet he has reached the conclusion that accepting prison as the natural form of his remaining life is worse than risking death. For the committed escaper, the decisive question becomes whether one is prepared to die. Once the answer is yes, the wire loses some of its power. Chapter 7. The White Kitten. Georgy Tenno's Tale. Solzhenitsyn gives this chapter largely to Tenno himself, allowing the escape to unfold from the fugitive's perspective. Tenno and Zhdanov begin by crawling toward the camp boundary beneath a watchtower. Tenno cuts the wire strand by strand, expecting machine gun fire after every sound. They cross the plowed security strip and disappear into the steppe. Freedom is immediate but incomplete. They have escaped the camp, not the Soviet system. Their bodies are weakened. Their heads identify them as prisoners. Their food is limited. They have no legitimate documents, and the surrounding settlements are filled with people who may report strangers. The first problem is therefore to create distance before the camp can organize a search. The story becomes a long series of improvised decisions. The men hide by day and move at night. Hunger and thirst force them toward yurts and houses. At one Kazakh dwelling they demand food and take dried mutton, fried dough, and kumis. Tenno is conscious that the fugitive who wants freedom can quickly become a threat to civilians. Their desperation creates a moral deterioration of its own. When ordinary hospitality is insufficient, they begin calculating what must be taken by force. Their journey toward the Irtish depends on fragmentary geography. They argue over roads and directions. Tenno discovers how dangerous disagreement between escape partners can be, and realizes that a group needs a final authority when a wrong turn may be fatal. Their equipment is primitive, their information uncertain, and chance repeatedly determines whether an encounter helps or destroys them. There are moments of kindness. A Kazakh sells them bread and potatoes. Other people give limited help without immediately reporting them. But every new contact is a gamble. They invent identities and occupations, claiming to be officials or workers traveling on business. A convincing lie requires details they do not possess. A request to see papers can collapse the entire performance. The men eventually acquire a boat and move along the Irtish, which seems at first to solve the navigation problem. River travel gives them direction and food opportunities, but it also forces contact with settlements. In one house, their invented story begins to unravel when the inhabitants insist on checking their documents. Tenno attacks his way out and pulls Janok free. They leave valuable equipment behind and continue with fewer resources. Another encounter turns violent and separates them. Tenno and Zdanok had begun carrying weapons taken during their flight. The distinction between political, fugitive, and armed outlaw becomes increasingly difficult for anyone they meet to perceive. Solzhenitsyn allows the reader to feel the pressure that produces this transformation without pretending that civilians have no reason to fear two armed strangers. Tenno is eventually captured. He is badly beaten and returned to custody. Zdanok continues alone, but the loss of his companion leaves him psychologically unstable. He steals chickens, keeps a conspicuous bicycle and gun, and approaches Omsk by a route the security operation is watching. At one house he breaks down in tears when treated sympathetically, only to discover that the inhabitants are suspicious of his shaved head and may report him. He takes clothing and escapes again. Near Omsk, an operations group disguised as ordinary workers follows him on a motorcycle and knocks him from his bicycle. Local women protest when they see the men beating him and ask what he has done. The simplest answer is given: he is a murderer. The women accept the official category and return to their work. Solzhenitsyn uses the scene to show the informational advantage of the state. The fugitive carries a complex history. The police need only supply a word. Tenno and Zdanok spend months in disciplinary confinement before trial. Investigators refuse to believe that they had no organized network, external rendezvous, or plan to cross a foreign frontier. The men jokingly claim that they were trying to reach Moscow to tell the Central Committee about illegal arrests. Their attempt is inflated into a collection of charges involving sabotage, banditry, robbery, and weapons. Yet the additional sentence has almost lost its deterrent force. They were already serving 25-year terms. After the escape, the practical difference is merely a later date in the 1970s. The authorities briefly consider an accusation of economic disruption because the search had cost the state heavily. Work sites were stopped, guards diverted, vehicles consumed fuel, search teams spread across the region, and hundreds of photographs were distributed. Tenno hears the accounting with pride. 2 prisoners had forced an enormous institution to spend days reacting to their refusal to remain where it put them. Solzhenitsyn ends with a bitter joke about culture. Because the escape had been concealed through preparations connected with the camp performance, the cultural group was punished and disbanded for a year. Culture, he remarks, is permitted so long as it serves oppression rather than freedom. Chapter 8. Escapes, Morale, and Mechanics. After Tenno's personal story, Solzhenitsyn broadens the subject into a history of escape from the special camps. Ordinary Gulag could treat a certain amount of flight almost as economic wastage. The special camps could not. They had been designed specifically for political prisoners, whom the state portrayed as exceptionally dangerous. A successful escape was therefore an institutional humiliation comparable, in official thinking, to allowing a major spy across a frontier. At the same time, the universal 25-year sentence weakened deterrence. A man already condemned to a quarter century could not easily be frightened by the possibility of another long term. The state strengthened fences at the same moment that it reduced the prisoner's reason to obey them. Solzhenitsyn recounts escapes from mines, work sites, transport, and camp zones. Grigory Kudla and Ivan Dushechkin exploit an old mine working near Jezkazgan. They gradually loosen a grating, hide supplies underground, claim illness during a night shift, climb through the old shaft, and emerge beyond the perimeter. The details matter because successful flight usually depends not on a single heroic dash, but on observing a small flaw and preparing patiently around it. Another fugitive, Stepan, survives alone in the steppe after companions seeking water are captured. He avoids people because people are more dangerous to him than wild animals. He hunts small animals, drinks blood when necessary, changes direction to avoid settlements, and struggles with rivers despite not knowing how to swim. When hunger finally forces him toward a yurt, unexpected hospitality temporarily saves him. Solzhenitsyn repeatedly returns to this uncertainty. The civilian outside the wire can be betrayer or rescuer, and the fugitive cannot know which in advance. Mass escape attempts create different technical problems. A tunnel requires surveying, excavation, lighting, disposal of earth, tools, shift organization, signals, camouflage, and discipline among everyone who knows the secret. At ekibastus, prisoners in disciplinary barracks attempt precisely such work. They calculate depth and direction, run electrical wire into the tunnel, organize digging shifts, and develop ways to remove soil without revealing the project. Their engineering abilities, which the state might have used freely in another society, are now devoted to defeating the prison architecture surrounding them. The administration responds by digging vehicle trenches, improving searches, monitoring barracks, and relying on informers. One attempted tunnel is betrayed because too many people know about it. Security and escape thus form an arms race. Each failed attempt teaches the guards. Each new barrier teaches the prisoners what problem must be solved next. Tenno, returned to disciplinary confinement after his own failed flight, finds fellow prisoners already working on another tunnel and becomes restless at first because they refuse to explain themselves. The secrecy is necessary even among men with strong anti-camp credentials. Eventually he understands the project. The conspirators even plan false clues so that, after escape, guards will search the wrong places and misunderstand how the prisoners left. The chapter also describes attempted collective breakouts and fugitives who remain free for days or weeks, only to be tracked down by mounted civilians, police, or operations groups. Reprisals after recapture are brutal. Solzhenitsyn contrasts this environment with the escape traditions of pre-revolutionary political prisoners. His argument is not that old Russia had no prisons. It is that the modern Soviet fugitive confronts a much denser system of documents, armed patrols, communications, collective responsibility, and a population conditioned to fear or denounce him. Escape, therefore, has a moral effect even when it fails. The disciplinary prisoners acquire status precisely because they are punished most severely. Men inside ordinary huts begin smuggling tools and materials to those attempting tunnels. The institution intends isolation to disgrace the rebel. Instead, punishment can identify him as someone who has resisted. For Solzhenitsyn, the most important achievement of the escape movement is not statistical success. Very few fugitives secure lasting freedom. The achievement is the recovery of agency. Every tunnel, cut wire, stolen vehicle, or hidden route contradicts the assumption that the prisoner must cooperate in his confinement. Escape converts the camp perimeter from an unquestioned boundary into a technical problem. That shift in imagination will feed directly into larger forms of resistance. Chapter 9. The Kids with Tommy Guns. The armed perimeter of the special camps was maintained largely by young conscripts. Solzhenitsyn calls them the kids with Tommy guns, because many had been born under Soviet rule, had little experience of life before the system they served, and were placed in a relationship of lethal power over prisoners much older and more experienced than themselves. Twice a day, guards and prisoners moved together between camp and work. The prisoners walked on the road while armed soldiers watched from the sides. Their relationship was physically intimate and morally distant. A false movement could legally be interpreted as an escape attempt. The guard could shoot a prisoner who stepped beyond a prescribed line, while the prisoner knew almost nothing about the young man carrying the weapon. Solzhenitsyn argues that ignorance was one of the essential security devices. Guards were politically instructed about the people they watched. Officers described Article 58 prisoners as fascists, traitors, spies, and enemies whose crimes justified hardness. Selected case files could be read aloud as examples. A guard repairing a relationship with a prisoner risked punishment because sympathy itself contradicted the category on which the system depended. He later encounters a former convoy soldier who remembers being taught that camp inmates were dangerous enemies while simultaneously resenting what appeared from the watchtower to be prisoner privileges. The young soldier could imagine that miners in the camp were well fed, or that prisoners spent the day avoiding work, because he saw only fragments and interpreted them through political instruction. The system also exploited the hardship of the guards. Many conscripts had not chosen this service. They were sent to remote regions, stood in severe cold, lived under military discipline, and obeyed officers who possessed power over them, as the guards possessed power over prisoners. Solzhenitsyn refuses to erase this context, but he equally refuses to let it erase responsibility. Whatever orders, propaganda, and hardship stood behind the act, it was these young men who held the guns, fired shots, kicked prisoners, and enforced the perimeter. One former guard, Volodya, becomes an example of the possibility of seeing through the assigned role. His own family had been touched by repression, and when he began speaking with political prisoners, he recognized relatives and ordinary human beings rather than the monsters described in political lectures. He posted letters, performed small favors, argued with other soldiers, and grew hostile toward his officers. His sympathy eventually brought interrogation and punishment. The same institution that demanded vigilance toward prisoners also punished a guard who allowed direct human knowledge to interfere with the official category. The chapter returns to one of Solzhenitsyn's recurring moral principles. Systems create roles, incentives, and ignorance, but the person inside the role is not completely dissolved. A guard can make conditions harsher or more humane. The difficulty is that mercy is institutionally risky, while severity is institutionally safe. The camp therefore does not need every young soldier to be naturally cruel. It needs a structure in which cruelty can be explained as duty and compassion as disobedience. Chapter 10. Behind the wire, the ground is burning. Solzhenitsyn begins with earlier eruptions of armed resistance. Camp uprisings had occurred before the famous revolts of the 1950s, but they were concealed so thoroughly that even participants and nearby prisoners often possessed only fragments of the story. He mentions the Retunin affair during the war, in which prisoners escaped, armed themselves, and attempted to live as partisans, and later outbreaks in which prisoners disarmed guards, opened camp gates, and tried to create a wider rebellion. These earlier attempts usually failed for familiar reasons. Some prisoners refused to leave even when the gate stood open. Short-term inmates feared converting a limited sentence into a political case. Criminals might use disorder to loot rather than fight. Loyalists could not bring themselves to rebel against the state. Armed forces outside the camp remained overwhelming. A revolt could open the local gate without opening the country around it. The special camps changed the human material. They concentrated prisoners already defined politically, many with extremely long sentences. Criminal prisoners had less ability to dominate them. Veterans of underground nationalist movements, particularly Ukrainians, Lithuanians, and others with organizational experience, lived beside Soviet officers, believers, and Russians embittered by years of imprisonment. The authorities had removed many of the old obstacles to collective action while trying to create a more secure prison. The first target of the new resistance was not the guards, but informers. Solzhenitsyn depicts the stool pigeon as the link through which camp security penetrated every conversation. An informer could turn a political remark, escape discussion, or personal complaint into a second case. As long as prisoners believed that anyone in the barracks might be reporting them, open organization was almost impossible. At Ekibastus, prisoners began killing identified informers and especially hated trustees. The violence was deliberate and politically transformative. Solzhenitsyn does not disguise it as a peaceful movement. Men armed themselves with knives and hunted people believed to have betrayed tunnels, conversations, or fellow inmates. Muslim prisoners organized retaliation after a brutal camp functionary struck one of their group. Other avengers pursued stool pigeons, even into administrative buildings. The camp commander himself discovers the limits of authority when armed prisoners follow an informer into his office. The prisoners have issued a rule that officers and warders are not to be attacked. The target is the informer. The terrified commander escapes while the stool pigeon is killed in front of him. The distinction is strategic. An attack on state personnel would invite immediate classification as terrorism and overwhelming armed retaliation. By directing violence at collaborators inside the prisoner population, the movement attacks the surveillance system while allowing administrators to describe events as ordinary criminal conflict. Only a small number of people are killed compared with the camp population, but Solzhenitsyn describes the psychological effect as enormous. Prisoners begin speaking openly because they believe the informer network is collapsing. Men who previously protected privileged positions suddenly seek friendships with ordinary workers. It becomes shameful to boast of living well at the expense of general labor. Trustees and suspected informers discover that the ground beneath them is no longer secure. Some flee into the disciplinary prison for protection. This reversal fascinates Solzhenitsyn. The people who once used camp authority against others now seek refuge behind the same stone walls meant to punish the rebellious. A man with what prisoners consider an unclean conscience can no longer sleep peacefully simply because security protects him. The authorities call the killings gangsterism and try to assimilate them to the criminal wars already occurring elsewhere in Gulag. Solzhenitsyn interprets this as bureaucratically convenient. If the conflict is merely one gang fighting another, camp officials need not admit that a political movement has appeared in institutions designed precisely to eliminate political organization. The deeper achievement is collective recognition. Prisoners look around and discover that they number in the thousands. They are not merely individual cases with private grievances. Whatever their original beliefs, they are political prisoners living under a common system. Solzhenitsyn treats the destruction of the informer network as the moment when fear begins changing sides. The wolves, as he puts it, realize that the prisoners are no longer the sheep they once were. Chapter 11. Tearing at the Chains. The collapse of the informer system does not end the conflict. It creates a new balance in which prisoners and camp authorities confront one another more directly. At Ekibastus, everyday relations briefly become almost civilized. Foremen behave more carefully. Warders shout less. Prisoners stop removing their caps automatically. Work continues, but the social hierarchy has shifted, because officials know that the camp population can act collectively. Neither side believes this equilibrium can last. A confrontation begins around the disciplinary prison. Prisoners attempt to break into it and free men held inside. Guards respond with machine gun fire from the perimeter. Bullets pass through thin barrack walls and kill or wound people who were not necessarily involved in the attack. The death of an older prisoner close to release exposes the arbitrariness of collective punishment. A man can survive nearly his entire sentence only to be killed in his bed by fire intended to suppress other prisoners. The response develops into a work stoppage and hunger strike. Solzhenitsyn describes the difficulty of maintaining unity. Some camp divisions support the action, while others, including a Ukrainian section whose solidarity the Russians had expected, initially continue working. Differences of nationality, tactics, fear, and leadership persist even after prisoners have acquired a collective political identity. The authorities alternate negotiation and preparation for punishment. Officials visit huts, speak more gently than before, and try to identify representatives. Behind that appearance, plans are made to isolate ringleaders. Eventually, prisoners are seized outside the camp, where their comrades cannot surround them. Guards force entire groups to sit under threat of gunfire while selected men are removed. Solzhenitsyn himself is ill during the aftermath. He attends one conference with officials and concludes that genuine verbal communication has almost broken down. The prisoners want to explain years of arbitrary punishment, informers, hunger, and second sentences. The officials demand names and administrative answers. Each side is speaking from a reality the other does not recognize. The strike is broken. Many men are arrested, transferred, or dispersed. Suspected informers who had secretly testified against the movement are later exposed through the authorities, need to use them in proceedings. Their identities become known in a camp world where political denunciation had traditionally remained hidden. The fact that stool pigeons can be publicly identified further weakens the old system of secret collaboration, yet the movement spreads by the very method used to suppress it. Prisoners transferred from Ekibastus carry the experience of resistance to other special camps. Men sent to Kengir arrive as living evidence that collective action is possible. The archipelago's transportation network, created to disperse danger, now distributes political knowledge. The death of Stalin in March 1953 and the arrest of Lavrentiy Beria intensify the crisis. Camp officials have built careers around institutions suddenly being criticized from above. Blue-bordered security insignia lose some prestige. Warders and officers become uncertain about what Moscow will now authorize. Prisoners sense that uncertainty immediately. At Norilsk, Solzhenitsyn knows that a major rebellion occurred, but admits that his evidence is insufficient to reconstruct it fully. At Vorkuta, however, he traces a large strike in the summer of 1953. Prisoners at mines and construction sites stop work, form committees, and demand the removal of number patches, window bars, and locks, together with correspondence, visits, and review of their cases. Unlike the earlier Ekibastuz hunger strike, they continue accepting food. They refuse to help the state defeat them by starving themselves. Senior officials arrive and acknowledge that some demands have merit while insisting that production resume, because the country needs coal. The prisoners answer that they need freedom. Some camp divisions weaken and return to work, but pit number 29 remains out. The state finally resolves a confrontation with force. Soldiers assemble outside the gate. Prisoners are ordered back to work. Those determined to maintain the strike form a human barrier. An officer is struck, and General Derevyanko gives the order to fire. Volleys and automatic fire kill scores of prisoners. Solzhenitsyn records 66 dead. The survivors are driven from the camp and arrests follow. Even his victory is incomplete. The security apparatus after Beria's fall is less confident about launching elaborate new political prosecutions. Many arrested strikers are transferred rather than subjected to the kind of mass new cases expected under Stalin. And some soldiers apparently fire above the crowd rather than directly into it, leaving bullet holes in roofs as evidence of individual refusal. The chains are not yet broken, but they are being pulled from several directions at once. Prisoners have learned to strike. Officials have learned that direct violence can produce further instability. Moscow has removed the supreme patron of the security system, and every transfer carries the story to another camp. Chapter 12. The 40 Days of Kengir. Kengir becomes the fullest expression of the movement born in the special camps. After Stalin's death and Beria's fall, prisoners expect meaningful change. Some disciplinary measures ease, and camp officials lose part of their former confidence. This creates hope, but hope can initially weaken resistance. If reform is coming from above, why risk punishment by fighting from below? Violence by guards reverses that mood. At Kengir, shootings and the abuse of prisoners provoke strikes. The administration also introduces groups of criminal prisoners into political camp divisions, apparently hoping that the old criminal hierarchy will restore control. Instead, the maneuver escapes its intended logic. Criminals and politicals clash, but the violence of guards against the criminals themselves helps create a temporary alliance. The physical structure of Kengir matters. Men's divisions, a women's camp, service yards, and prison buildings stand inside a larger common perimeter separated by internal walls. Prisoners break through those internal barriers. Men enter the women's camp. Women protect fugitives and resist searches. Other prisoners breach additional walls and jail buildings. Within a short time, most of the camp is united, and ordinary NVD authority has withdrawn. For the prisoners, the first experience is less like governing a revolution than like suddenly living. Men and women who had communicated secretly across barriers can meet. Couples see each other openly. Religious believers pray together. National groups gather. Foreigners find compatriots. No work siren drives them into an 11-hour day. After years in which even walking across a yard required permission, thousands of people experience an improvised freedom inside the same outer fence. Negotiations begin. Visiting officials acknowledge some complaints, promise investigations, discuss removing number patches and locks, and appear to accept the holes made between camp divisions. Prisoners want punishment for those responsible for shootings, review of cases, freer correspondence and visits, and changes to the camp regime. The ease with which officials make promises encourages many inmates to believe they have already won. The camp then organizes itself. A commission is elected, with former Red Army Colonel Kapitan Kuznetsov as its leading figure. Departments take responsibility for food, security, technical work, information, and negotiations. Order is maintained. The kitchens operate. The prisoners prevent indiscriminate violence and try to keep the movement from being represented as a criminal riot. Kuznetsov insists on a loyal Soviet political line. He argues that explicitly anti-Soviet slogans would give the authorities an excuse for immediate destruction. Public signs, therefore, appeal to the Central Committee and demand that high officials come to investigate. This moderation produces tension. Some prisoners, after years of punishment, feel no reason to disguise their hatred of the system. Kuznetsov believes survival depends on presenting the revolt as a demand for Soviet legality rather than a rejection of Soviet power. The prisoners' improvised administration becomes technically ingenious. When outside electricity is cut, specialists experiment with alternative power and construct a tiny generating system driven by water pressure. They create internal communications and even attempt radio transmission. They prepare defenses, manufacture makeshift weapons, and organize observation posts. A propaganda war develops around the fence. Outside loudspeakers accuse the rebels of criminal violence, promise mercy to defectors, demand a return to work, and circulate stories intended to divide them. Inside, the prisoners answer with their own loudspeakers and leaflets. They try balloons and then kites to carry messages over the perimeter to the free settlement. The authorities send people to collect leaflets and eventually use counter-kites. Solzhenitsyn pauses on the absurd image. In the age of modern aviation, a struggle over political truth is fought with kites. As negotiations drag on, the outside force grows. Breaches appear in the perimeter in preparation for assault. The prisoners build internal barricades and manufacture pikes and improvised incendiary devices, fully aware that such weapons are almost useless against machine guns and tanks. The point is no longer realistic military victory. It is whether the camp will surrender its short-lived self-government without resistance. The authorities repeatedly promise review and reform while emphasizing that production must resume. Prisoners demand that a member of the Presidium of the Central Committee come personally. On June 22nd, an outside broadcast announces that their demands have been accepted and that a senior party representative is coming. Tension falls. Solzhenitsyn interprets the announcement as part of the preparation for attack. Before dawn on June 25th, flares illuminate the camp. Snipers shoot observers from the roofs. Aircraft pass overhead. T-34 tanks move toward prepared gaps in the fence, with armed troops behind them. The prisoners had prepared for soldiers. Tanks turn the disparity into something almost grotesque. Some prisoners resist with stones, improvised bombs, and charges against the troops. Tanks drive through barricades and into barrack areas. Solzhenitsyn records women and men crushed beneath tracks or against buildings. Some couples choose to die together. Assault troops occupy the camp, seize the leaders, and load prisoners into vehicles. The revolt ends militarily, but not historically. The administration forces survivors to repair the walls. Trials of leaders take place later in secret. Yet the old special camp order is not restored in full. Across the archipelago, bars and locks are being removed, number patches discarded, sentences reviewed, and prisoners released. Kengir is crushed at the moment when the institution that produced it has already begun changing. For Solzhenitsyn, the 40 days demonstrate what decades of repression had hidden. Prisoners were capable not only of suffering, but of organization, discipline, solidarity, technical improvisation, negotiation, and open resistance. The revolt did not overthrow the Soviet system. It did something smaller but essential to his argument. It disproved the assumption that the population of the archipelago had accepted slavery as its natural condition. Part 6. Exile. Chapter 1. Exile in the First Years of Freedom. Solzhenitsyn begins Part 6 by treating exile as an institution older than prison. To expel a person from the tribe, village, or homeland is to sever the web of familiar relationships that makes ordinary life possible. Russia's enormous geography made exile a recurring instrument of state power for centuries, and Solzhenitsyn reviews that history before returning to the Soviet system. Under the Russian Empire, exile developed many forms. Convicts, vagrants, political offenders, and administrative exiles could all be sent eastward. Conditions varied enormously. Some criminal exiles experienced great hardship, while political exiles in the 19th and early 20th centuries often possessed freedoms unimaginable to later Soviet prisoners. The exile had a defined term. In some cases, he could eventually be registered as a peasant and relocate. Political exiles could study, write, teach, work for newspapers, socialize with local intellectuals, and receive money allowances. Solzhenitsyn deliberately chooses famous revolutionaries as examples. Khrushchev could own a house. Pushkin's banishment did not resemble a prison camp. Decembrists and later political figures maintained family and cultural lives. Lenin and other revolutionaries received state subsistence payments in exile and could devote significant time to reading, writing, and political thought. In some Siberian towns, political exiles became doctors, teachers, researchers, journalists, and informal advisors to the local population. His purpose is polemical. Soviet historical memory repeatedly described Tsarist exile as a symbol of intolerable oppression. Yet many of the people who later created the Soviet punitive system had personally experienced an older exile regime that recognized their political identity and preserved space for intellectual activity. After taking power, they dismantled many of the conditions they had once considered elementary. The Soviet state institutionalized administrative exile early. By 1922, a permanent commission could banish people regarded as socially dangerous or associated with non-Bolshevik political parties. The categories then widened beyond organized opponents to include independent intellectuals, former members of the old establishment, clergy, believers, young people punished for cultural behavior, and many others. At first, some socialist political exiles continued receiving small allowances, but inflation and reductions made them inadequate. Employment could cause even those payments to be withdrawn. More importantly, exile lost the support of independent public opinion. In the old regime, political exiles had been able to appeal to newspapers, lawyers, political allies, and sympathizers. Under Soviet rule, a person who publicly repeated an exile's protest might himself be punished. The security police could move exiles suddenly, extend their banishment, arrest them again, or convert exile into imprisonment. Political communities that had once practiced mutual aid learned to avoid gatherings because any group could be interpreted as an organization. Exiles began imposing a second exile on themselves through isolation. By the 1930s, exile frequently became not a final punishment but a waiting room before the next arrest. Solzhenitsyn gives examples of people reaching the apparent end of a term only to receive a fresh case, imprisonment, or even a death sentence. The Soviet exile therefore differs from the image of a settled person living at a distance from home. The exile can never be certain that today's place of banishment is not simply the staging point for tomorrow's prison train. Chapter 2. The Peasant Plague. Solzhenitsyn turns to the largest and most destructive exile operation in the volume, the mass uprooting of peasants during collectivization. He calls it a plague because it spread through the countryside with the impersonal force of catastrophe, while being directed by policy rather than disease. He contrasts the enormous cultural attention given to wartime deaths with the near silence surrounding millions of peasants destroyed through dispossession, deportation, hunger, and forced settlement. The category kulak suggests a wealthy exploiter, but Solzhenitsyn reconstructs individual families to show how elastic the label became. One major example is the family of the poet Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. His father, Trifon, was a village blacksmith descended from a poor family. Years of work produced a modest house, a forge, a horse, occasional livestock, a small orchard, and partially cleared land. None of this represented large-scale capitalist wealth. Yet collectivization required households to be classified, and officials could invent assessments of income that made confiscation inevitable. The mechanism repeated across villages. A household distinguished by skill, energy, a better horse, a trade, or simple independence could be declared kulak. Tax demands beyond the family's capacity could create the evidence of noncompliance. Property was inventoried and confiscated. The family was expelled from its home and transported to a destination it had not chosen. Solzhenitsyn gives another example in Timofey Ovchinnikov, a literate and industrious peasant who had fought in war, practiced some veterinary medicine, planted an orchard, and briefly participated in a small sausage-making enterprise during the new economic policy. He later joined a collective farm and transferred his property into it. Old tax classifications and local hostility nevertheless continued pursuing him. Officials seized clothing and livestock. When even household plants were inventoried as property for confiscation, he destroyed them in anger. Such acts could then be converted into proof of hostility to the state. The chapter insists that collectivization did not end as a single campaign in 1929 or 1930. Grain seizures and famine continued to ravage regions afterward. Peasants could work through the harvest and then discover that almost everything had been taken for state procurement. When women protested hunger, officials could answer by searching for remaining kulaks or saboteurs. The deportation itself often had no serious settlement plan behind it. Families were unloaded in forests, tundra, steppe, or Arctic regions, and told that they had arrived. Some spent polar winters in tents. Others dug earthen shelters. Volga Germans were placed in dry areas with inadequate water. Peasants sent to canal projects could arrive before housing existed and be told to construct their own shelter after completing forced work. Solzhenitsyn emphasizes the cruelty of forbidding assistance. In Archangel, starving special settlers wandered through town while local people were warned not to feed or shelter them. Those who attempted kindness risked losing passports or attracting police attention. Bodies could remain in public places because fear prevented ordinary human response. The choice of settlement sites could be irrational, even by the standards of survival. Communities were placed high above rivers or far from suitable fields, as if the purpose were not simply economic resettlement, but the breaking of a social class. Peasants whose lives had always been organized around animals and land could be sent to places where neither ordinary farming nor familiar household life was possible. Yet, people adapted. Solzhenitsyn recounts old believers who fled collectivization deep into the taiga and managed to live for roughly 2 decades outside Soviet institutions. They manufactured much of what they needed, traded cautiously for salt and metal, and remained physically strong. Eventually, aviation revealed their settlement, and the state reached them too. Their story becomes a small counterexample to the claim that collectivization rescued peasants from backwardness. These people had chosen isolation among wild animals over the social order offered to them. The peasant plague, in Solzhenitsyn's interpretation, accomplished a political transformation deeper than individual deportations. The removal or destruction of independent households helped cement the collective farm system. The countryside learned what resistance could cost. Even if agricultural life later became depleted and villages declined, the immediate political goal had been achieved. The state had broken a social world capable of standing outside its direct control. Chapter 3. The ranks of exile thicken. The peasant deportations were uniquely vast and brutal, but exile continued expanding after them. Solzhenitsyn sketches a changing system. In the 1920s, exile often served as a preliminary stage before camp imprisonment. By the mid-1930s, it had become a major punitive institution in its own right. During and after the war, it expanded further because it could absorb families and large populations without the expense of constructing fences, barracks, and guard towers. After 1948, exile acquired another function, preventing political prisoners from returning to ordinary Soviet society after they had completed their camp sentences. Many Article 58 prisoners were released from one form of captivity directly into compulsory settlement. Instead of crossing from camp into the mainland, they moved from one administrative enclosure into another. The population of this exile world was extraordinarily mixed. Families of prisoners joined people deported for nationality, wartime history, foreign connections, or administrative suspicion. Some former prisoners of war received exile instead of a standard camp term. Others were permitted to live in their native district, but forbidden to leave it. The logic of classification was often inconsistent, but the result was a broad intermediate country between prison and full citizenship. Karaganda becomes one of Solzhenitsyn's examples of an exile capital. By the mid-1950s, much of the population lacked ordinary passports or had to report to the police. Former prisoners recognized one another in the streets. Work existed, especially in heavy industry, but professional qualifications could be difficult to prove after years of arrest and camp. Exiles often received inferior jobs or wages and paid high rents for poor living space. In more remote places, exile could be so economically desperate that people asked to be sent back to camp, because at least camp provided rations. Old and sick prisoners arriving after long sentences might be assigned to logging, salt works, or other jobs employers themselves considered barely suitable. A successful naval architect could find himself packing salt because the system treated the exile chiefly as labor to be placed somewhere. Solzhenitsyn compares the moral position of the exile with the prisoner. Camp has obvious coercion, but also definite routines. The prisoner knows where he sleeps and receives some ration. In exile, a person can be nominally free while dependent on employers, police registration, housing, and local officials. A superior can demand unpaid work or threaten dismissal in a place where no alternative employment exists. Some former prisoners therefore describe special camp life as paradoxically more secure. Escape from exile also becomes a severe crime. A person who leaves the assigned district can receive years of hard labor. Solzhenitsyn gives examples deliberately chosen for their absurdity, including elderly women attempting to return to relatives and a man trying to reach his nearly blind mother. The law treats the journey home not as an ordinary movement, but as flight from state custody. The security organs remain present throughout. Operations sections recruit informers, collect denunciations, and open new cases. An exile who has escaped the density of camp surveillance can still be pulled back into the archipelago by a conversation or report. This encourages isolation. Exiles avoid photographs, meetings, and intimate political conversation because a group of friends can be reconstructed as an underground organization. The exile system therefore achieves control with less visible machinery than the camp. No watchtower is required if employment, documents, police reporting, geography, and the possibility of a new sentence keep the person in place. Chapter 4. Nations in Exile. The logic of administrative exile reaches its most extreme form when the unit of punishment becomes an entire people. Solzhenitsyn presents 20th century Soviet deportations as a radical expansion of state power. Guilt no longer needs even the fiction of being individual. National identity itself can determine removal. The Soviet system had already developed the administrative category of the special settler during collectivization. That experience provided the machinery for later national deportations. Once a population could be designated collectively, military units could surround settlements, impose a short deadline, load families into trucks and trains, confiscate abandoned property, and send the whole community thousands of kilometers away. Solzhenitsyn names Chechens, Ingush, Karachay, Balkars, Kalmyks, Kurds, Crimean Tatars, Caucasian Greeks, and others who entered this system, while also discussing earlier deportations and the treatment of the Baltic populations. The exact procedures varied, but the principle was uniformity. Infants, old people, mothers, veterans, and children not yet born were all covered by the same collective status. A child born years after the original deportation could begin life already classified as a special settler. The process became increasingly efficient. Families might receive only minutes to dress, collect what they could carry, sign away claims to property, and leave their homes. The operation was military because individual legal proceedings would make mass removal impossible. The designation of an entire nation as unreliable eliminated the need to ask what a particular person had done. The Baltic case differs in form but illustrates the same expansion of political cleansing. Initial Soviet occupation brought arrests, executions, and deportations of prominent or socially targeted people. After Soviet power returned in 1944, new waves of imprisonment and removal followed, and later collectivization generated further deportations. Solzhenitsyn emphasizes the separation of heads of families from women and children, and the uncertainty surrounding the destination of each group. Life in special settlement varied according to region and occupation. Some deportees were sent to mines. Others entered prospecting artels working deposits the state considered too marginal for normal production. These supposedly free labor groups could lack ordinary labor protections while still facing prosecution for failure to work. Others were placed in collective farms where they combined the disadvantages of kolkhoz life with the coercive powers of the MVD. Solzhenitsyn compares how different national communities adapted. Germans often rebuilt stable households with remarkable persistence, becoming valued workers in mines, machine stations, and farms, and gradually acquiring relatively solid homes and livestock. This did not make the deportation just. It showed the capacity of a disciplined community to reconstruct life under imposed conditions. His description of the Chechens is very different and reflects his own observations in Kazakhstan. He portrays them as refusing to regard exile as a permanent home. They remain openly hostile to authority, avoid investing emotionally in the settlements, resist assimilation, and preserve strong internal customs. Solzhenitsyn is sharply critical of theft and violence associated with some of them, but he is equally struck by their refusal to become submissive. A local episode involving blood vengeance becomes, for him, a study of competing systems of authority. After a murder, the threat of traditional revenge paralyzes local party, school, police, and MVD officials who otherwise appear omnipotent. Solzhenitsyn concludes, provocatively, that the ancient law of vengeance creates a field of fear around the community and thereby helps preserve its cohesion. He does not present the custom as humane. He uses it to show that a people retaining its own enforceable moral code can possess a kind of collective strength that atomized Soviet citizens have lost. The larger chapter is about the destruction and survival of group identity. Deportation tries to detach peoples from ancestral territory and make administrative classification stronger than history. Yet exile also reveals that communities respond differently. Some rebuild, some assimilate partly, some resist, and some preserve language, religion, family structure, or collective memory with exceptional tenacity. The state can move a population physically without necessarily controlling what that population believes about why it was moved. Chapter 5. End of sentence. For years, the prisoner imagines the expiration of his sentence as a clean line dividing captivity from freedom. In the camp calendar, the release date acquires almost mystical importance. Winters are counted against it, letters are measured by it, and every illness raises the question of whether the body will last long enough to reach it. Yet the Soviet system repeatedly dissolved this distinction. A political prisoner could complete the term imposed by court or special board and discover that he was not permitted to return home at all. Release from camp became the beginning of exile. Solzhenitsyn had already encountered men who received this news before the gate opened. During the late Stalin period, many Article 58 prisoners finishing their terms were designated for perpetual exile in remote districts. The formula was especially cruel because it preserved the appearance that the sentence had ended. The prisoner was technically no longer a zek, but the state still determined where he could live, where he could work, and when he had to report to the security authorities. The man who had spent years dreaming of one particular date reached it only to discover that freedom had been postponed without a new crime. Solzhenitsyn's own release from Ekibastuz in 1953 therefore had a strange double character. He was leaving the camp, yet he was not going home. His destination had already been selected for him, Kokterik in Kazakhstan. Even the journey out of imprisonment retained the forms of imprisonment. Released exiles could still be moved under Interior Ministry supervision, lodged temporarily in jails, transported in official vehicles, and handed from one authority to another. The prisoner's legal category changed faster than the habits of the institutions handling his body. The contrast made small liberties overwhelming. During the journey, Solzhenitsyn encountered other former prisoners and exiles, among them men whose biographies had been broken into the same sequence of arrest, camp, and compulsory settlement. The group could speak more freely than convicts under convoy, but no one confused this condition with full civic freedom. They were people released from one ring of control into another. When Solzhenitsyn finally reached Kokterik, one of the first shocks was the right to walk without an armed escort. For years, every movement had been organized through gates, counts, commands, columns, and prohibited lines. Now he could stand in a settlement and choose whether to turn right or left. The choice was trivial by any ordinary measure, yet it possessed the emotional force of a major event. Freedom returned not as an abstract constitutional principle, but as the ability to direct one's own feet. His first lodging was almost comically poor, a low, rough room associated with a henhouse, with an earthen floor and little comfort. But it had something no camp barracks could provide. He could close himself inside and be alone. Darkness belonged to him. Silence belonged to him. Nobody inspected the bunk, counted the inhabitants, or ordered everyone to rise. The poverty of the room, therefore, mattered less than the fact that it was private. A prisoner learns that comfort and freedom are different goods, and after enough years behind wire, the second can make the first almost irrelevant. The timing gave the transition an additional historical charge. Stalin died just as Solzhenitsyn was beginning exile. The official reaction in the settlement was public grief. Schoolteachers and citizens wept, meetings mourned the leader, and the established language of catastrophe surrounded the announcement. Solzhenitsyn experienced almost the opposite emotion. The man whose name had dominated the political system under which he had been arrested and imprisoned was gone. Yet even in exile he could not safely display relief. His face had to participate in the ritual expected around him while his thoughts moved elsewhere. This necessity reveals how limited his freedom still was. Exile had no barbed wire, but it retained political surveillance. The former prisoner understood that careless speech could reopen the route to camp. One could be released and still live inside the habits created by interrogation. Measure the listener, control the expression, avoid unnecessary confidence. The body had crossed the gate before the mind could safely abandon the techniques of captivity. Soon the political landscape began shifting. The security bureaucracy was reorganized after Stalin's death, and the fall of Beria altered the atmosphere. Prisoners and exiles heard rumors, watched personnel changes, and tried to interpret what they meant. No one knew whether the movement represented a temporary struggle among rulers or a genuine alteration in the system. After decades in which every rumor of amnesty had disappointed someone, experienced prisoners had learned not to convert political change too quickly into hope. Still, the end of sentence meant something real. Solzhenitsyn could now seek work, rent a room, walk through the village, converse with free people, and begin reconstructing a life. The state remained present, but it no longer controlled each spoonful of food or each trip to the latrine. The release date had not delivered the freedom he once imagined, yet it had widened the field in which personal action was possible. The chapter therefore complicates the meaning of liberation. Camp had trained prisoners to think of freedom as a single event. The gate opens and the nightmare ends. Exile shows that Soviet coercion could be arranged in concentric circles. Inside the central circle stood the prisoner under guard. Beyond him stood the special settler or perpetual exile. Beyond that stood the ordinary citizen, whose residence, employment, passport, and political speech were still subject to state control. Moving outward mattered enormously, but there was no single line after which power disappeared. Solzhenitsyn also understands that the years behind wire have permanently changed what he notices. A free man who has never been imprisoned can complain about the quality of a room, the distance to work, or the inconvenience of a village. The released zek is astonished by an unlocked door and the ability to decide when to step outside. The end of sentence, therefore, restores more than mobility. It reveals the quantity of unnoticed freedom contained in ordinary life. Chapter 6. The Good Life in Exile. Once settled in Kokterek, Solzhenitsyn had to solve the ordinary problem of earning a living under extraordinary administrative conditions. Before arrest, he had been a teacher and army officer. In camp, he had been reduced to general labor, technical assignments, and the status of a political prisoner. Exile did not automatically restore his profession. Local offices could refuse employment without explaining themselves, and an exile could not simply leave for another city where opportunities were better. He wanted to teach mathematics and physics. At first, the educational bureaucracy told him that the district had no vacancy. The statement had the authority of an official fact, even when reality contradicted it. Shortly afterward, circumstances changed, another office intervened, or the personnel need became impossible to deny, and he was assigned to a school. Solzhenitsyn uses the episode to show that exile was less a coherent legal regime than life under layers of discretionary administration. The same system that declared a job impossible could make it possible through another signature. Teaching transformed his existence. For the first time in years, his daily work had a purpose he accepted. He was responsible for explaining mathematics rather than fulfilling an absurd production norm. The difference restored an element of professional identity that prison had nearly erased. A class of schoolchildren could demand effort without humiliating him. Work chosen, or at least meaningful, had a moral quality entirely different from labor, compelled by hunger. Many of his pupils came from families marked by exile, deportation, poverty, or political disadvantage. For them, school represented one of the few routes toward a life beyond inherited stigma. Solzhenitsyn found them serious about learning. Their situation exposed another contradiction of Soviet social policy. The state had displaced or degraded their families. Yet the same state maintained schools in which intelligence and discipline could sometimes create real opportunities. Institutions that injured people were not incapable of containing useful human work. Soviet life could rarely be reduced to a single moral color. The teacher's room offered another education. The school existed inside a local hierarchy of favors, fear, personal connections, and administrative pressure. Gifts could matter. Officials could expect subordinate teachers to assist with correspondence courses or other work needed for their own advancement. Marks and evaluations were not always protected from influence. A person who resisted local authority risked consequences extending beyond the classroom. Solzhenitsyn was particularly impressed by people who refused to adapt quietly to corruption. One was Georgy Mitrovich, a Serbian former prisoner and teacher whose sense of justice repeatedly brought him into conflict with local authorities. Mitrović wrote complaints, challenged abuses, and pursued disputes beyond the level where most people would have surrendered. He was not powerful, but the act of appealing to Moscow against local wrongdoing demonstrated how some former prisoners used the limited openings after Stalin's death. The bureaucracy was still formidable, yet it no longer seemed uniformly invulnerable. Katorga itself was a relatively favorable place of exile compared with the northern mines, salt works, or empty steppe settlements described earlier. It was an inhabited agricultural district rather than a work camp disguised as a village. Exiles could rent rooms, cultivate gardens, teach, practice trades, and form relationships with local residents. This relative normality explains why some people later chose to remain, even after restrictions weakened. A place selected as punishment could become a home once years of life accumulated there. Solzhenitsyn eventually referred to this period with the deliberately paradoxical phrase, good or beautiful exile. He did not mean that compulsory banishment was just. He meant that his own circumstances happened to give him what camp had denied: useful work, solitude, time for writing, access to ordinary human relationships, and enough security to think beyond the next ration. Compared with the archipelago, Katorga could feel almost luxurious even when measured by ordinary standards. It was poor and remote. The period also allowed his secret literary work to expand. In camp he had been forced to compose and memorize because a manuscript could be confiscated. In exile the practical possibilities widened, but secrecy remained essential. Writing openly about camps or Stalinist repression could return him to the system he was describing. The new freedom, therefore, contained a peculiar division. Externally, he was a provincial teacher. Internally, he was preserving and developing testimony that could not safely exist in public. As the post-Stalin political changes advanced, categories of exile began to loosen. The diplomacy surrounding West Germany contributed to an amnesty that released Germans, and measures widened to include other groups convicted of wartime collaboration or related offenses. Nationalities and special settler populations were gradually removed from registration or permitted to return. Each decree produced unequal consequences. One group learned it could go home while the neighboring family remained restricted. Administrative liberation arrived in installments just as repression had. For the exile, these changes were difficult to interpret morally. A decree could restore movement without admitting that the original punishment had been wrong. A prisoner or deportee might be released because policy had changed, not because an authority recognized his innocence. The distinction mattered deeply to Solzhenitsyn. Mercy granted from above left the state in the position of benefactor. Rehabilitation, by contrast, implied that the state had committed an injustice and owed something to the person it had condemned. When Solzhenitsyn's own case was later reconsidered, he again encountered the institutions that had once processed him as an enemy. Returning to the Lubyanka under entirely different circumstances produced an almost theatrical reversal. He could enter the building without being dragged there, speak with officials, and discuss his case, rather than submit to interrogation. Yet years of experience had taught him caution. He knew that institutions and political climates can change faster than the habits of power. Appearing harmless remained prudent, even when the same state now contemplated clearing his name. The good life in exile thus becomes another lesson in relativity. A compulsory settlement can seem free after camp. A poor room can seem rich after a barracks. A bureaucratic school can seem humane after a work brigade. But Solzhenitsyn does not allow these comparisons to erase the underlying fact that exile was imposed. Gratitude for recovered liberties is compatible with judgment of the authority that removed them. At the same time, exile gave him direct experience of how quickly human life reconstructs itself once a little space appears. People marry, teach, plant, argue, read, help neighbors, pursue careers, and create new communities, even when their location began as a punishment. The state can determine geography without entirely determining meaning. What was designed as banishment can become the setting in which a person recovers a profession and prepares the work through which he will later challenge the system itself. Chapter 7. Ziks at Liberty. The formal liberation of a prisoner creates a new social category, the former zek. The gate may open, the certificate may declare the sentence completed, and the train may carry the person toward a city that once meant home. Yet Solzhenitsyn insists that release does not restore the life interrupted years earlier. The prisoner returns with a damaged body, a political biography, broken relationships, missing possessions, and habits adapted to a society behind wire. The first obstacle is often administrative. A former prisoner needs registration in order to live legally, yet registration may be denied because of the conviction. Without registration, employment and housing become harder to obtain. Without employment or housing, registration becomes harder. The released person encounters a circular bureaucracy capable of producing homelessness without formally sentencing anyone to it. Solzhenitsyn recounts people who sleep in railway stations or wander among offices, despite possessing papers saying they are free. One example is Stolyarova, who discovers that the official end of punishment does not guarantee a place in ordinary society. Another is Avenir Borisov, who returns to old acquaintances and finds that fear has edited him out of their past. In a family photograph, his face has literally been inked over. The gesture condenses years of Soviet self-protection. During his imprisonment, association with him had been dangerous enough that people erased his image. Release cannot simply restore the trust destroyed by that fear. In remote camp regions, freedom could even worsen material conditions. A prisoner approaching release might possess a bunk, ration, work assignment, and minimal medical access, because the camp was obligated to keep him functioning. Once discharged, those guarantees vanished. A person in Kolyma or another isolated region could find himself free on paper but unable to afford transport, housing, or food. Staying near the former camp might be the only practical option. The institution that had consumed his labor could continue shaping his geography after it ceased feeding him. Yet many released prisoners experience an intense first period of happiness. Trees, roads, shop windows, railway platforms, private rooms, ordinary meals, and conversations without guards recover a brightness that free people rarely notice. Solzhenitsyn observes former prisoners who avoid acquiring possessions because confiscation has taught them not to trust property. Others respond in the opposite direction. Having been deprived for years, they accumulate clothes, food, money, furniture, sexual experiences, professional status, or travel with almost frantic intensity. These reactions are not simply personal quirks. Camp has distorted the scale of desire. One person discovers that possessions are unnecessary because everything can be taken. Another tries to prove freedom by possessing everything that was denied. One becomes ascetic, another acquisitive. One cannot tolerate authority, another pursues a position that finally places him above others. The archipelago continues living inside the released prisoner, through habits that no decree can cancel. For many, forgetting becomes a deliberate survival strategy. The former prisoner does not want to retell interrogations at every dinner table or explain years of hunger to people who cannot understand them. Family members may prefer silence because they suffered too and want the household to become ordinary. Employers may dislike the biography. New friends may become uncomfortable. The easiest path is to close the camp years as if they belong to another person. Solzhenitsyn calls attention to the cost of this defensive reflex. If each survivor privately decides to forget, the state receives the historical silence it once enforced through censorship. Millions of individual acts of self-protection can erase a national event almost as effectively as an official ban. Memory therefore becomes a public obligation precisely because forgetting is psychologically understandable. Family reunion is among the cruelest tests. A child left at 3 may meet a father after 10 or 15 years as a stranger. A wife who waited at first may have built another life. Parents die while sentences continue. Prisoners preserve an image of home frozen at the moment of arrest, but the people outside continue aging and changing. The state cannot return the years it removed. Rehabilitation can restore a legal status but not recreate a childhood or marriage. Some former prisoners also encounter the moral discomfort of people who participated in their cases. Investigators, informers, false witnesses, judges, and camp officials frequently remain in ordinary employment. Political change may condemn the excesses of the past while leaving individual responsibility unresolved. Solzhenitsyn is angered by explanations based on time limits, expired statutes, orders from above, or the difficulty of proving acts committed within secret institutions. The victim served the entire sentence. The official who fabricated it can invoke the passage of time. This problem becomes central to his understanding of rehabilitation. A document stating that a conviction has been annulled is important. It can restore a name, pension, employment rights, or social standing. But if the process treats the injustice as an impersonal error, then nobody is responsible for producing it. A state can rehabilitate thousands administratively while avoiding the public judgment necessary to explain how thousands were falsely condemned in the first place. Solzhenitsyn does not demand that every guard or clerk be punished equally. He distinguishes degrees of responsibility and repeatedly warns against revenge as a substitute for justice. What he rejects is the idea that successful participation in repression should end with complete anonymity. A society that refuses even to identify deliberate torturers, perjurers, and organizers of mass injustice teaches future officials that political wrongdoing is a safe career, if one survives the political season in which it is useful. Released prisoners themselves respond differently. Some want trials, some want only their family in quiet. Some remain communist and blame individual abuses. Some become radical opponents of the entire order. Others are too exhausted to form a political conclusion. The variety matters because suffering does not manufacture one ideological type. The same camp can produce an ascetic, a careerist, a believer, a cynic, an activist, and a man who wants never to hear the word gulag again. The chapter's title, Zeks at Liberty, therefore contains a deliberate contradiction. A former prisoner can be physically outside the zone while continuing to live in a society shaped by the same institutions and in a personality shaped by years within them. Freedom is real, but it is not clean. The wire has been removed from the immediate horizon, yet employment rules, housing, memory, fear, damaged families, and unresolved responsibility extend its influence outward. Solzhenitsyn's broader argument is that liberation must include truth if it is to become complete. Opening gates is necessary. Ending exile is necessary. Rehabilitating innocent people is necessary. But a country cannot fully leave the archipelago behind, while its history remains euphemized, and the mechanisms that created it are treated as accidents without authors. The former Zek needs more than a certificate. Society needs to understand why the certificate became necessary. Part 7, Stalin is no more, Chapter 1, Looking Back on It All. Part 7 begins after the central figure associated with the terror has died, and after Solzhenitsyn himself has returned from camp in exile. The physical archipelago still exists, but another struggle has begun. The struggle over how the country will remember it. Solzhenitsyn had once assumed that truthful writing about the camps could appear only after his own death. The brief cultural opening under Khrushchev unexpectedly disturbed that calculation. The publication of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich was therefore almost as astonishing to Solzhenitsyn as it was to many readers. For the first time, a work openly centered on an ordinary Soviet political prisoner's camp day appeared in a major Soviet journal with official permission. The event suggested that facts long confined to kitchens, prison memories, private letters, and whispered conversations might enter public language. Responses poured toward him. Former prisoners recognized details that free readers might consider invented or exaggerated. Some wrote with gratitude because a small portion of their own lives had finally become printable. Others reacted with anxiety. They had spent years learning that a person could be arrested for far less than publishing a camp story, and they could not believe that official approval guaranteed safety. The instinct created by repression survived the political moment that seemed to contradict it. Yet Solzhenitsyn quickly discovered the boundaries of the thaw. The emerging official explanation reduced the catastrophe to the cult of Stalin's personality and to violations committed during a particular period. The party in this account had ultimately corrected itself. The correct conclusion was, therefore, not to question the political structure that permitted arbitrary arrest and forced labor, but to praise the forces within that structure that had restored legality. For Solzhenitsyn, this narrative was too narrow. The archipelago had begun before Stalin's mature dictatorship, and institutions of political repression continued after his death. To say merely that abuses occurred under the personality cult separated the crimes from the legal doctrines, security organs, administrative habits, ideological classifications, and economic uses of forced labor that made them possible. A ruler could die while the machinery survived. Current prisoners sharpened the point. Some managed to communicate that a literary account of Stalin-era camp life was inadequate if readers imagined that camps had disappeared. The details had changed, and many prisoners had been released, but confinement, Punitive labor, guards, restrictions, and political cases remained. For someone still behind wire, public celebration of a book about past suffering could sound almost insulting if it implied that repression now belonged safely to history. The contradiction reached an absurd form when one day could be praised outside while access to it remained restricted inside some camps. Prisoners for whom the fictional camp day was ordinary reality might have to obtain the story secretly or pass it from hand to hand. The state could permit discussion of Gulag as a corrected historical error while remaining uneasy about allowing present prisoners to use the same text as a mirror of their own condition. Solzhenitsyn also examines the response of those who had worked for the system. When political winds changed, many officials insisted that they had simply performed their duties according to the instructions of the time. Investigators had followed orders, prosecutors had applied the law, guards had obeyed regulations, and administrators had fulfilled plans. Responsibility dissolved into hierarchy. Everyone appeared as a small transmission mechanism, while the people who gave the highest orders were dead, disgraced, or conveniently distant. He rejects this unlimited defense of obedience. A large coercive system certainly distributes decisions, and a junior guard cannot be judged as if he designed the Gulag. But some acts remain intelligible at the individual level. Beating a prisoner, fabricating testimony, stealing a parcel, knowingly signing a false accusation, or sending someone to punishment out of personal malice. Political orders may explain the context without erasing agency. The problem of accountability becomes more difficult when an entire generation has participated in some portion of the machinery. A serious investigation would not uncover one villain but thousands of investigators, judges, informers, administrators, camp officials, party secretaries, and ordinary citizens whose careers intersected with repression. The temptation is therefore to sacrifice a few famous names and close the subject. The larger the crime, paradoxically, the more socially convenient amnesia can become. Solzhenitsyn watches the official language narrow again. The opening that permitted Ivan Denisovich does not develop into unrestricted investigation of the archipelago. Cultural authorities become cautious. References that were acceptable for a short period again become politically dangerous. By the middle of the 1960s, voices at ideological meetings could even speak favorably about restoring concepts such as enemy of the people, a term whose historical consequences former prisoners understood immediately. This reversal demonstrates why Solzhenitsyn distrusts claims that the past can never return. Institutions do not become harmless because a speech denounces former abuses. If the legal and political mechanisms remain available, a later leadership can recover them. A society protected only by the promise that present rulers are wiser possesses no durable protection against future rulers who are not. Looking back, therefore, has a practical purpose. Memory is not a ceremony performed for the dead while the living move on. The point of recovering arrests, false cases, camps, deportations, hunger, executions, and resistance is to identify what made them possible. If public memory isolates Stalin as a monstrous exception, it may condemn the man while preserving the assumptions that allowed extraordinary power to accumulate around him. Solzhenitsyn also recognizes how difficult genuine memory is for survivors. Many want no more trouble. Some have rebuilt careers under the same institutions that once expelled them. Others fear that speaking will endanger children. Some remain loyal to the political ideal and prefer to interpret their own suffering as an aberration. The silence surrounding the archipelago, therefore, cannot be attributed only to censorship from above. Fear, exhaustion, loyalty, and the desire for normal life all help close the archive. His own unexpected publication shows both the possibilities and the limits of a thought controlled by rulers. For a moment, millions can recognize themselves in literature that yesterday was unprintable. But if the permission itself comes from the same political hierarchy, it can be withdrawn just as abruptly. Truth that depends on a ruler's favorable decision is not yet secure public truth. The chapter thus turns the entire preceding history into a question addressed to the present. What does it mean to acknowledge the Gulag? Is it enough to release prisoners, rename institutions, and blame a dead dictator? Or must society establish principles that make arbitrary power impossible regardless of who governs? Solzhenitsyn's answer is implicit in his insistence on memory. A country has not escaped the archipelago merely because it has begun speaking about it in the past tense. Chapter 2. Rulers change, the archipelago remains. The years after Stalin's death brought changes that prisoners could feel directly. Beria fell, mass reviews of cases began, and the special camp system created for the most dangerous political prisoners was dismantled or softened. Number patches disappeared from many uniforms. Bars and locks inside camp zones were removed. Correspondence became easier. Visits, wages, and the right to possess money expanded. Some prisoners could enter lighter regimes, live beyond the central compound, or obtain parole. Foreign prisoners and special categories were released in substantial numbers. The transformation was real. A man who had spent years forbidden to write home might suddenly receive letters. A prisoner known only by a number could again be called by a name. A camp that had been designed around 25-year sentences could begin disgorging people after a review commission arrived. The political atmosphere behind wire changed faster than many inmates had believed possible. Solzhenitsyn nevertheless objects to the moral form in which some reviews were conducted. A commission could approach a prisoner whose case had been fabricated and offer release if he acknowledged at least some guilt or expressed repentance. The prisoner faced an obvious temptation. After years of confinement, why sacrifice freedom over a phrase? Yet accepting the formula preserved the state's position. Authority remained the generous power forgiving an offender rather than the guilty power, admitting that it had imprisoned an innocent person. This distinction mattered because mass release without mass rehabilitation left the historical record ambiguous. If a prisoner was merely amnestied, the conviction technically retained moral weight. If his case was annulled for lack of a crime, responsibility shifted toward the people and institutions that created it. A government wishing to empty camps without opening the full problem of state guilt naturally preferred the first path where possible. The releases also created an illusion that the camp system itself was disappearing. Solzhenitsyn insists that it was not. New prisoners continued to arrive in the middle and later 1950s. Criminal colonies remained, political cases did not vanish, and the administrative structure capable of expanding again was preserved. A reduction in population is not the same thing as abolition of the institution. As political conditions hardened again, especially around the beginning of the 1960s, prison regimes could become stricter. Categories multiplied. Restrictions on parcels, correspondence, clothing, movement, and internal life were rewritten. The details differed from the high Stalinist period, but the old logic remained recognizable. Security administrators assumed that the prisoner should be controlled more tightly than necessity alone required. Solzhenitsyn eventually had an unusual opportunity to discuss prison conditions with officials engaged in drafting or revising regulations. Instead of speaking only as a former victim, he approached the problem almost as a penal administrator should have approached it. Which restrictions actually serve security, and which exist merely to humiliate? Why should prisoners be denied ordinary clothing if escape can be prevented by other means? Why forbid gardens, grass, cooking, parcels, or harmless possessions? Why make correspondence artificially scarce? Why preserve military drill and unnecessary forms of submission inside institutions supposedly devoted to correction? These questions expose how punishment accumulates by habit. A rule may begin under emergency conditions and survive because nobody receives a career benefit for removing it. The administrator asks why a prisoner needs a particular liberty. Solzhenitsyn reverses the burden. If the restriction serves no necessary purpose, why should the state possess it? Some officials responded seriously. They could agree that food parcels should be permitted more broadly, that letters need not be as restricted, that prisoners should have some ability to cook or purchase goods, and that daily treatment need not imitate the most militarized camp traditions. Solzhenitsyn does not present every person inside the post-Stalin penal bureaucracy as eager to restore terror. The problem is institutional inertia rather than a conspiracy of identical personalities. But the limits of reform become visible quickly. Officials defend striped or distinctive clothing because prisoners must be recognizable. They insist on guard structures and prohibited zones. They resist allowing camps to become too comfortable because punishment is expected to look like punishment. Even aesthetic questions, such as whether prisoners should see grass or maintain flower beds, can be filtered through the assumption that deprivation has moral value. One discussion turns to the quality of warders. Officials complain that the service cannot attract better people. Solzhenitsyn sees the circularity. If prison work is organized around contempt and violence, the occupation selects and trains people suited to those methods. Their behavior then becomes an argument for stricter control over prisoners. Reform requires changing not only written rules but the moral status of the people being guarded. The economic contradictions remain as well. Prisoners may be paid wages, but prices, deductions, ration systems, and compulsory employment determine what those wages mean. Work is still not freely contracted. A prisoner who produces effectively can remain legally powerless before an administration that decides housing, correspondence, discipline, and release conditions. The presence of money does not convert forced labor automatically into ordinary employment. Solzhenitsyn is particularly struck by the persistence of gratuitous humiliation. A state may plausibly claim that it needs walls, locks, and guards around people convicted of serious crimes. It is harder to justify why those people must also be denied harmless contact, privacy, decent clothing, or the ordinary sight of nature. Such restrictions reveal that the penal institution seeks not only to prevent dangerous acts, but to remind the prisoner continuously of inferiority. The post-Stalin changes therefore constitute a genuine improvement without solving the deeper question. Thousands and then millions regain freedom. Death rates fall. The special camps lose some of their most brutal characteristics. But the legal and administrative idea of the archipelago survives. A centralized state retains a large captive population governed through rules that citizens outside cannot meaningfully supervise. This is why the chapter's title separates rulers from institutions. Stalin's death matters. Beria's fall matters. Khrushchev's reforms matter. Individual policy can make the difference between execution and release for enormous numbers of people. Yet if every improvement depends on the personality of the ruler, then the system has preserved the same vulnerability that made the earlier catastrophe possible. A durable change would require law capable of binding rulers, independent review of accusations, public knowledge of prisons, meaningful rights for defendants and convicts, and officials who cannot hide behind secret instructions. Without those restraints, the archipelago can contract and expand according to political climate. Its islands may change names, populations, and regimes, but the map remains available. Solzhenitsyn therefore refuses the comforting equation. Stalin is dead, therefore Gulag is history. The death of a ruler can close one era of repression. It cannot by itself abolish the habits of secrecy, administrative discretion, ideological prosecution, and institutional self-protection accumulated over decades. The archipelago survives whenever the state retains the power to recreate its old relationship to the individual. Chapter 3. The Law Today. The final chapter confronts the official claim that political repression has ended and that contemporary Soviet prisons contain only ordinary criminals. Solzhenitsyn asks the reader to test this assurance not against speeches, but against events. If citizens can still be punished for political or religious conduct, if courts remain subordinate to administrative direction, and if public protests can be met with secret violence, then the legal foundations of the archipelago remain active. The most dramatic example is Novocherkassk in 1962. Economic grievances over wages and rising living costs produced unrest among workers at a major locomotive plant. These were not aristocrats, foreign agents, or former opposition politicians. They were industrial workers belonging to the social class in whose name the Soviet state claimed historical legitimacy. The dispute escalated into a strike. Workers left their jobs, argued with factory officials, and drew others into the protest. Attempts by local authorities to dismiss or contain the grievances failed. The crowd moved from workplace protest toward a public demonstration. Railway traffic was obstructed, slogans appeared, and people began marching toward the center of Novocherkassk. Solzhenitsyn emphasizes the political irony of the procession. Demonstrators could carry Soviet symbols and portraits associated with the revolution, rather than symbols of a counter-revolutionary army. Their demands arose from lived economic conditions. Yet once a large crowd challenged local authority outside approved channels, the security interpretation changed. What the workers understood as protest could be reconstructed by the state as disorder or hostile provocation. Troops and armored vehicles entered the city. The visible presence of military force transformed the conflict immediately. Soviet soldiers faced Soviet workers in a Soviet industrial center, each side surrounded by the language of a state that officially represented them both. Local civilians reportedly spoke to soldiers and appealed to them not to fire. The confrontation ended in gunfire. Solzhenitsyn's sources described shots striking people in the square, and even children who had climbed trees to watch. The crowd fled under fire. He reports estimates of roughly 70 or 80 dead. while the event itself was hidden from ordinary public discussion. Exact numbers were difficult to establish precisely because secrecy surrounded the operation. The dead did not receive the kind of public political burial that might have transformed the shooting into a national scandal. Information was controlled, families faced uncertainty, and later proceedings concentrated on supposed organizers and participants. The state could describe the disturbance as the work of hostile or criminal elements, rather than as evidence that workers had brought genuine grievances into conflict with authority. For Solzhenitsyn, Novocherkassk is crucial not because it repeats the Great Terror numerically. It does not. Its significance lies in the survival of a method. When political order is threatened, authorities conceal an event, introduce armed force, kill citizens, define the dead or protesting population through hostile categories, conduct prosecutions, and prevent society from openly reconstructing what occurred. Religious persecution provides another test. The post-Stalin state can proclaim legality while believers continue to receive sentences for forms of worship, organization, teaching, or resistance to official control. Solzhenitsyn cites information collected among Baptists and relatives of religious prisoners showing numerous convictions in the early 1960s. The accused include elderly people, family members, and even a disabled or blind veteran. Their conduct cannot plausibly be explained as ordinary theft or violence. Such cases reveal the flexibility of the claim that there are no political prisoners. The state does not need to label a person political in order to punish him for a conflict with political policy. A believer convicted under an article framed as violation of public order or unlawful organization can disappear statistically into the category of criminal. Terminology hides continuity. Solzhenitsyn then turns from spectacular cases to the ordinary operation of law. Investigators, prosecutors, and judges belong to institutions with their own interests. An investigator who closes a case for lack of evidence may appear to have wasted time or admitted error. A prosecutor who overturns an investigation exposes another official's work. A higher court reversing a lower court can be interpreted as evidence that someone performed badly. The system, therefore, contains pressure toward confirming previous decisions. Once a person has been arrested, every stage can acquire an institutional reason to preserve the accusation. The investigator demonstrates competence by producing a case. The prosecutor demonstrates vigilance by approving it. The court demonstrates consistency by convicting. An appeal then challenges not one official, but the work of several institutions. The accused confronts a chain in which professional self-protection can substitute for independent evaluation. Political influence need not always arrive as a written order. A telephone call, party instruction, expectation from a superior, or general understanding of the desired result can be enough. The official who knows which outcome is politically acceptable does not need a document explaining how to reach it. This form of guidance is especially difficult to challenge later because the paper file may look formally legal. The existence of printed codes, therefore, does not satisfy Solzhenitsyn. Law worthy of the name must stand above the immediate political need of rulers and administrators. If the rule changes in practice when a party committee intervenes, then the citizen possesses a statute but not a reliable legal boundary. The experience of the earlier archipelago demonstrates how rapidly elastic law can be expanded when the political climate demands enemies. He is also skeptical of promises that the old mass repression simply cannot return because society has changed. Institutions can store techniques. Security organs retain personnel and archives. Prisons and colonies retain physical infrastructure. Prosecutors and courts retain habits of deference. Political language retains categories through which dissent can be represented as danger. A future crisis does not need to invent the machinery from nothing. This is the deepest continuity between the early revolutionary chapters and the law of Solzhenitsyn's present. The scale has changed enormously. Millions are no longer moving through the same annual waves of arrest. Yet the relationship between power and law remains insecure wherever authority can decide first that a political result is necessary and only afterward select the legal language that supports it. Novocherkassk also returns the argument to public opinion. One reason Tsarist political prisoners had possessed leverage in Solzhenitsyn's earlier comparison was that society could know about cases and react. A modern state with newspapers, telephones, railways, and advanced technology possesses much greater capacity to inform citizens, but censorship can use the same technology to fragment knowledge. A shooting in an industrial city can become a rumor rather than a public fact. The suppression of knowledge is itself legal power. Families who cannot openly name the dead cannot organize a common account. Workers in another city cannot judge whether the grievances resemble their own. Lawyers and writers cannot debate the use of force if the event officially does not exist. Secrecy prevents political experience from becoming political memory. Solzhenitsyn's final accusation is therefore broader than the existence of particular prisoners. He argues that a state remains dangerous when its law is subordinate to administrative command. Humane rulers can use such a system more gently. Reforming rulers can release people. But neither kindness nor reform is equivalent to an independent legal order. The vast history of the archipelago has shown what happens when political necessity becomes sufficient reason for arrest, investigation, sentence, exile, and forced labor. The final question is whether the principle has been repudiated or merely used less extensively. Solzhenitsyn sees too much continuity to accept the reassuring answer. Volume 3 thus approaches its end with no simple liberation. Stalin is gone. Many prisoners are free. Special camps have been dismantled. Whole populations released from exile. And crimes once unspeakable have briefly entered print. These changes are enormous and should not be denied. But the state that produced the archipelago has not placed law securely above itself. The conclusion returns to the problem running through all 3 volumes. The most important protection against another archipelago is not the character of the current ruler. It is the existence of institutions, public memory, and moral habits that prevent any ruler from acquiring the same unchecked power. Without them, laws can be beautifully printed while the decisive rule remains the will of authority. Afterword. In the afterword, Solzhenitsyn turns from the history he has reconstructed to the unusual conditions under which the reconstruction itself was made. A work of this scale, he says, ought naturally to have been collective. The archipelago contained millions of lives, thousands of institutions, and experiences spread across decades and an entire continent. No single survivor could have seen more than a fraction. He therefore depended on testimony. Former prisoners supplied memories, letters, episodes, names, local customs, transport routes, punishments, resistance, and details of camp administration that lay outside his own experience. Yet the political environment made genuine collaborative authorship nearly impossible. People who might have worked openly with him risked renewed persecution, loss of employment, searches, or confiscation. Even Varlam Shalamov, one of the most formidable literary witnesses of the camps, did not become the co-author Solzhenitsyn might have wished for. Under normal conditions, an historian could establish an office, announce the project, collect documents, interview witnesses systematically, compare archives, and employ assistants. Solzhenitsyn had to do almost the opposite. Materials were dispersed among trusted people. Pages and notes could not safely remain together. Writing had to be hidden, copied, memorized, transported, and protected from searches. The history of a secret prison system itself had to be written as secret literature. The danger was not theoretical. In September 1965, the authorities seized part of his archive. The possibility that years of work could disappear in a single search shaped the physical construction of the book. Manuscripts that a free writer might keep together on one desk had to exist in fragments and hiding places. Friends became custodians of pieces, whose significance they could not always discuss openly. Solzhenitsyn therefore asks the reader to understand the book's unevenness. Its movement can be abrupt. Evidence is stronger for some camps and years than others. Stories arrive from testimony that could not always be verified against archives, and subjects deserving entire volumes receive a few pages. These defects are not presented as virtues. They are the scars left on the work by the conditions of persecuted literature. He had also reached a personal limit. To make the account indefinitely more complete would require devoting the remainder of his life to accumulation. Every survivor could add another camp, convoy, investigation, exile settlement, or biography. The archipelago was too large for a final exhaustive book. At some point, testimony had to be released into history, even while gaps remained. For that reason, he invites future witnesses and researchers to correct and supplement what he has written. The purpose is not to protect his authority as the sole interpreter of Gulag. It is to preserve a reality the state had fragmented and concealed. If open historical work ever becomes possible, later generations should have access to documents and testimonies he could not obtain. He records the years of composition as part of the work's meaning. The book was assembled across the period from the late 1950s through the 1960s, decades after the earliest revolutionary camps, and while some of the institutions he describes were still operating. The 50th anniversary of the revolution that created the Soviet system approached while he completed a history of the punitive world that had grown within it. He also notes the centenary of the invention of barbed wire, the simple technology that had become one of the symbols of the archipelago. The afterword, therefore, refuses the appearance of a finished monument. The Gulag Archipelago is a recovered fragment assembled under pressure from many fragments of memory. Its incompleteness reflects the destruction of witnesses, secrecy of archives, and continuing danger surrounding the subject. The book can end, but the work of remembering cannot. The method also explains why Solzhenitsyn repeatedly distinguishes between personal certainty and collective testimony throughout the 3 volumes. He could speak directly about arrests, prisons, sharashkas, camps, exile, and rehabilitation that he experienced, but the archipelago extended far beyond his route. Other prisoners supplied the parts of the map he had never visited. The book's authority, therefore, rests not on pretending that one witness saw everything, but on placing many partial witnesses beside one another until recurring institutions and practices become visible. This collective basis gives the work the character of a memorial as much as a history. Many people who might have written their own accounts never returned, lacked the opportunity to write, or died before the political climate permitted even private testimony. Solzhenitsyn's task is consequently burdened by absence. Every surviving anecdote can point toward experiences for which no narrator remains. The gaps are not empty because nothing happened there. They are often empty because the people who knew were destroyed or silenced. PPS. In the final postscript, Solzhenitsyn explains that even after he thought the manuscript complete, political events gave him an unexpected additional interval for revision. His public conflict with the Soviet literary establishment, including his letter to the Writers' Congress, made him expect that arrest, searches, or loss of his manuscripts might follow. Instead, he remained free long enough to return to the book. Trusted friends were able to read portions and point out defects. Corrections and additions could be made, though the conditions remained clandestine. The paradox continued to the end. He was revising a vast single work without ever being able to keep the whole of that work safely assembled before him on one desk. This limitation reinforces rather than changes his final claim. No version could become complete. Too many witnesses were dead, too many records inaccessible, too many regions known only through fragments. The only honest ending was to acknowledge what remained missing and to thank the unnamed people whose memories, courage, safekeeping, and criticism had allowed the book to exist. The postscript is dated May 1968. By then, the manuscript represents years of secret labor, layered on top of years of imprisonment, exile, conversation, and memorization. Its final form is therefore not merely a literary summary of the archipelago. The circumstances of its creation are themselves evidence of the society it describes. Even after leaving the camps, a survivor still had to hide the history of what had happened inside them. Solzhenitsyn closes without claiming the last word. The archipelago was too large for any one person to possess. What he could do was make enough of it visible that future silence would require an active choice, rather than simple ignorance. The final revisions also depended on trust. A manuscript about secret police, camps, executions, and resistance could endanger not only the author, but anyone sheltering a copy. The unnamed helpers therefore participated in the book through acts that ordinary literary production would never require. Hiding pages, moving material, reading under conditions of secrecy, and accepting the risk that someone else's history could bring the authorities to their own doors. That hidden collaboration mirrors the book's deepest purpose. The state had isolated victims so that each arrest, sentence, camp, and death could appear as a separate private misfortune. The manuscript reverses that isolation by joining the fragments. What had happened separately to millions of people becomes visible as one connected archipelago.